Are we ready to get started? Okay. Okay, welcome everybody in the classroom and online at other campuses. What, Barstow, and what's the other campuses participating in this?
Victor Valley and
Victor Valley
and Riverside College.
Riverside, okay. Well, great. I'm going to spend a few minutes running through Darrel's eminent qualifications to talk with us today. I'm very grateful to the Philosophy Club and to Will Moellendorf, our department chair, for organizing this, and Tim had the lion's share of involvement and making this a Southern California wide event. Darrel has a bachelor's in liberal arts from St. John's College in New Mexico. Where is that? Albuquerque? No. Albuquerque?
It's in Santa Fe, but I spent most of my time in Annapolis, Maryland.
Oh, okay. Okay. Very, very good liberal arts college. I met Darrel at Claremont Graduate School in the 80s, and I'll say more about that at the end. We had the same dissertation advisor, Al Lausch, who we both remember very fondly. His dissertation, believe it or not, I bet you would never guess this, is on Hegel's philosophy of subjective spirit. And I don't think you've used Hegel much in your work subsequently, but it's always a fallback. You get tired of working on current events. And he went to a Bolt Hall School of Law, I think for a year or 2 years, again in the 90s. But his PhD is from Claremont, and that's where I got to know him. I think the first teaching gig you had was at Pomona College, if I vaguely remember. You were there for a brief period of time. Then you went to Riverside Community College, Cal Poly, Pomona, then to South Africa for a number of years at the University of Witwatersrand, then to San Diego State, and now you are the Professor of International Political Theory and Professor of Philosophy at the Johann Wolfgang Goethe University in Frankfurt. Darrel has published several books. The first one that came out is Cosmopolitan Justice, 2002, Global Inequality Matters, 2009, The Moral Challenge of Dangerous Climate Change, 2014, and the book especially focused on today is called Mobilizing Hope, Climate Change, and Global Poverty in the 21st Century. Let me just end not with the glowing, academic credentials of Darrel. I've known Darrel since the early to mid 1980s at Claremont, and he is one of the few philosophers of his rank who actually has been an activist and knows the difficulties and the joy of organizing. We go back to the anti-apartheid movement days, Central America Solidarity. He was a union activist in the California Faculty Association, my union prior to coming to Cerritos College. And I'm going to tell a little story that will probably embarrass us both, but that's okay. In the height of the anti-apartheid movement, it wasn't just college campuses, some of his graduate students at Claremont circulated a petition. And I don't know how we hit upon this particular item, but we wanted the Hano Library of the Claremont Colleges to subscribe to the African National Congress's theoretical journal, which is called Sechaba. Is that correct?
I think.
Yeah. So we met with the librarian, Darrel, and Joe Lynch, another graduate student, and I. And we went in there spoiling for a fight. I didn't know what we were going to do if the head librarian had declined our proposal. But we were really geared up. This was a local issue that we felt strongly about. The library should have the African National Congress's theoretical journal. And he said yes. And that was it. It was so easy. The issues that Darrel is going to talk about us today are not nearly so easy, but we're very privileged to have Darrel as an eminent philosopher, but with an activist heart, and that's a rare combination these days. And I have benefited over the years from reading and discussing many things with Darrel, not least of which the relative importance in the punk music scene of the 1980s, Husker Du from Minneapolis, or the Minutemen, who were San Pedro based. So thank you all for showing up. Thanks again for Will and the Philosophy Club for organizing this. And I think, Darrel, you're going to speak for 40 minutes and then Q&A for the rest of the time. Is that right?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. Do you prefer comments, questions in the chat, or should people just raise their hand and be recognized by you?
I guess either way is fine with me. Either way will work. Yeah, I'll try to keep my eye on the chat.
Okay. Okay. Great.
Okay.
Okay.
But if I, it's sometimes a little hard to multitask. So if I don't call on you and I'm neglecting you, then try to make yourself known. But first of all, I have to say thank you, Ted. And it's so great to see you again. I've never had an introduction quite like that, and it's one of the best I've ever had. And I had forgotten all about that story. It would be nice if the victories were also easy, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Can I tell you one more follow-up? I checked Honnold Library's holdings. They have 1985 to 1989 when the journal was discontinued for good reasons in post-apartheid South Africa.
Right.
So they still have it on the shelves.
Right. That's impressive. That's great. No, that's really good. That's really great to hear. So I have a PowerPoint presentation, and so I want to do my screen share here. Well, yeah, let me do this first, and then we'll say something more. I have to move this around a bit. So, first of all, can everybody see that all right? Is that working?
Yep.
Yep. Okay, great. I'm not going to be able to see the chat as I do this, but so I'll just talk and then I'll look in the chat after I'm done, I guess. Thanks everybody for attending. Thanks, Will, for the invitation. Thanks to the philosophy clubs for organizing this. And it's really delightful to be able to do this and to be able to speak to people so far away, the wonders of Zoom and communication technology. I'm really happy and I'm honored that you all are here to listen to what I have to say. I'm going to talk about the book that I published last year called Mobilizing Hope, Climate Change and Global Poverty. It's going to be sort of a brief run through that book. It'll be highly attenuated, highly abbreviated, and there's much more that we could talk about and maybe we'll want to talk about as we get into the discussion. But I'm just going to do a very short version of it for right now. So there's 5 parts to the talk. I'll just say a couple of brief words about the climate crisis. I imagine most of you are fairly familiar about the basic details of the climate crisis. I want to talk about just one aspect of what I call a pro-poor climate theory. There are other aspects of it that are developed in the book, but I'll talk about just one to kind of give you a taste for how the book tries to incorporate considerations of global poverty into an overall approach to climate justice. Then I'll try to give you a part of an explanation for why it is that we're doing so little about climate change, what the holdup is. It's not the only reason, but it's a major reason, and I think politically the most important reason. And then I'm going to give a little bit of a kind of a philosophical interpretation of what failure to deal with climate change would mean, what it would say about humanity. And then I'll try to close on something of a hopeful note. We'll talk about a hopeful politics moving forward. I should also say, if you hear a roaring sound in the background, it's not that there's a plane taking off in my room as I'm talking, but the doctors have got me on a 24-hour blood pressure monitor thing. And I don't know if any of you have ever had this experience, but you have this strap on your arm for 24 hours, and occasionally it just does this blood pressure test as you're talking every 15 minutes. So you're going to hear it once or twice probably as I'm talking. I'll try to ignore it, but it is somewhat uncomfortable. Okay, now my screen is, oh, there we go. I'm going to I'm having a hard time seeing what I need to see. I have to move this around, sorry. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the climate crisis. The World Meteorological Organization issued a report in 2022, so last year. And according to the report, greenhouse gas emissions have reached new highs in the atmosphere. The atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases are over 400 parts per million. That's relevant because prior to the Industrial Revolution, they were at about 280 parts per million. So there's been this incredible increase, and it continues to increase the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. These, of course, are what are fueling climate change. Figure out which of these buttons is actually advancing the screen. At the moment, none of them are. Sorry, let me see what I can do here. Okay, from 2015 to 2021, we experienced the 7 hottest years on record since humanity's been keeping record of the global mean temperature. Sea level rise has reached new record highs in 2021, and the sea levels have been increasing at 4.5 millimeters per year over a period of 2013 to 2021. Steady increase. This corresponds with the increase of the temperature, which corresponds to the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere. Ocean acidification is now greater than it's been in 26,000 years. And this is a function of the CO2 in the atmosphere. The CO2 comes back down to the planet, to the surface of the planet, either through plant respiration or by being absorbed into the ocean. So as we get more CO2 in the atmosphere, the ocean becomes more acidic, and that's very bad for ocean biodiversity. In particular, it's bad for coral reefs, which are killed by acidification of too high of a level, and coral reefs are a sort of fundamental staple of ocean biodiversity. August 2022, in the part of the world that I live in, Europe, was the hottest on record. It was the hottest for a very long time. So we had the worst drought for a very long time, for the last 500 years, the worst drought since the mega drought of 1540. And of course, our problems in Europe are pale in consideration to problems in other parts of the world. In Pakistan, there was this torrential rain that was higher than a 30-year average, displaced 33 million people, and caused the death of more than 1,000 people. The Secretary General of the United Nations said last year that, quote, "We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator." So that's the grim news of climate change. That's in a very brief sort of sketch. And I want to say a little bit more about where we are and where we need to be. The United Nations Environmental Program issued a report last year called the Emissions Gap. The emissions gap is the difference between where we need to be to meet Paris goals of limiting warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees and where in fact we are now. And according to the United Nations Environmental Program study, quote, "The world is still falling short of the Paris climate goals with no credible pathway to 1.5 degrees in place." And this was also confirmed by the most recent report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We're not in any way on path to reaching the goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, which was the ambitious goal that was stated in the Paris Agreement of 2015. Given all of the policies that are currently in place by the various governments of the world, if these aren't changed, the planet is likely to warm to 2.8 degrees. This is, of course, an estimate, and it's an estimate based upon uncertainty about the relationship of warming to, or the relationship of CO2 to warming, but it's the best estimate given the current science. If all countries were to honor the unconditional pledges that they made, the pledges that they made that were not conditional on other parties doing anything, then the planet would still warm to 2.6 degrees. That's somewhat better, slightly better, but of course, these are just the pledges. If you've ever made a New Year's resolution, you know that there's a big difference between making the pledge and actually carrying it out. So it's not particularly good news. If all of the pledges plus the commitments that countries have made, which have occurred over the last couple of years. There have been a number of countries that have made pledges to net zero by 2050 or shortly thereafter. If all of those were also met, warming would be limited to 1.8 degrees. This is still higher than the 1.5 degree, but below the 2 degree mark. But of course, this is all just a matter of promises and not a matter of contemporary or current policy. So we're very much behind where we need to be. It's probably worth saying that there's a big difference between meeting the goal of 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says that half a degree, the degree difference between half degree difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, is the difference between hundreds of millions of people being trapped in poverty in the coming generations. So it's not insignificant that that the best we might do is 1.8 degrees given current pledges. Okay, so that's the state of affairs. Part of what I try to do in the book is argue that there is an important connection between climate change and global poverty. And the connection the connection that I'm concerned about in the book is a moral connection, but it's based upon certain causal relations. One of which is that if you care about global poverty, then you simply have to care about climate change, because climate change, as I just mentioned, will immiserate hundreds of millions of people. But it's also the case that if you care about climate change, you should be concerned about global poverty. And this is in part because there's not going to be a credible way of dealing with climate change without dealing with global poverty. And I'll try to explain why in just a minute. But this puts the approach of the book sort of in line with the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. The first of those goals is to end poverty in all of its form. That's the no poverty diagram that you see there. It also sort of puts the book in line with this very important encyclical of Pope Francis of a couple of years ago, the Laudato Si, in which Francis says that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach, that it must integrate questions of justice and debates about the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. That's very much on par with the sentiment of the book. So one of the ways that I do that in the book is to talk about the importance of something called the right to promote sustainable development. And this is an international norm that that's written into the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Treaty. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is the international body under which international negotiations for climate change occur, but it's also a treaty document itself. The treaty document is what is the written text that's the basis of the institution. And in the treaty document in Article 3, paragraph 4, it stated that the parties are the states that have signed on to the treaty. The parties have the right to and should promote sustainable development. And this idea that there's a right to promote sustainable development is one of the key features of the argument in the book that global poverty and climate change are intimately bound together. So how do I understand this idea that states have a right to and should promote sustainable development? My interpretation of that treaty language is that states have a certain kind of liberty. They have a certain kind of liberty to promote poverty eradicating human development. That in the context of an international agreement and an international cooperative effort to limit climate change, that states that are still developing have the liberty to continue to pursue human development efforts that will eradicate poverty. That's my understanding of what that right means. So it means then the international effort to mitigate climate change and to deal adequately with climate change has to take into consideration the aims of developing and least developed countries to eradicate poverty, to take into consideration their efforts to do so. Now so it's a claim of international justice then, right? It's a claim that developing states and underdeveloped states, developing states have against high income states. And that way, then it's a fundamental principle of international justice. You might ask why climate change is in any way even related to the question of development. And this has in part to do with the fact that much of the world still lives in a condition that we call energy poverty. Energy poverty is constituted really by two features. One is a lack of electricity, and almost 1.5 billion people in the world still live without access to electricity in their homes and in their communities. This means, of course, that schools don't have electricity. It means that hospitals don't have electricity. It means that children have to study by candlelight. It also means that there aren't factories that people can go to for employment because there's just not electricity in those regions. And almost 3 billion people burn biomass for energy. So they burn animal dung or they burn wood to stay warm and to cook on. And burning biomass is a major health consideration. It's responsible for respiratory diseases that are very damaging, particularly to young children, but also to women who cook over these flames. As a health danger, it rivals, for example, malaria and HIV/AIDS as a problem globally. And it's also the case that when you burn biomass, of course, the biomass has to be collected first before it's burnt. And collecting biomass is a very dangerous activity. It makes women and children vulnerable to sexual predators, which is a serious problem. So this is just one of the ways in which poverty sort of has these compound terrible effects on people. And if you're concerned about dealing with those effects, then you have to be concerned about bringing modern forms of energy to people. And that's part of the human development effort. And of course, energy is something that historically, at least, has been very tied up with CO2 emissions. So that's just a map to show you the parts of the world in which energy poverty is a problem, primarily in Africa, but also in Southern Asia and parts of Southeast Asia. And we know from experience, from very important experience, that the human development project is one that is very energy intensive. When I talk about human development, I don't mean just making people wealthier. I don't mean just increasing people's income. Human development is, in the discussion about development, is actually a technical term, and it's measured according to 3 different axes, one of which is the idea that people should have access to education. Another is that people should have access to healthcare. And then the third is a monetary measure. It's the idea that income is important. So as countries make improvements in health attainments, and as they make improvements in educational attainments, and as the average income in the country increases, then the human development index of that country increases as well. So it's a multidimensional index that takes into consideration then health, education, and income. And as I said, this is, as it turns out, correlated very strongly to energy consumption. The best example of this historically, of recent history, is the case of China. In China in 1990 had a human development index rating of just under 0.5, and it had an energy consumption of 0.5 megawatts per person. The significance of that number in terms of what it means is less important than the comparison that I'm about to make. So this is what I want to show you. By 2015, in that 35-year period, that 25-year period between 1990 and 2015, 800 million people were brought out of poverty in China. It's a world historical development that's hardly really talked about in the West, but it's the most dramatic poverty alleviation effort in human history. 800 million people were brought out of poverty. The Human Development Index increased very substantially, and the energy consumption increased 8-fold. So it's a very, very stark evidence to suggest that if we care about human development increases, if we care about eradicating poverty, then we have to care about energy consumption, increasing energy consumption in the developing world. Unfortunately, in the case of China, because of the way in which electricity has been generated at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, this meant that there was something on the order of also a 4-fold increase in CO2 emissions in China. A very similar story could be told about Thailand, but I won't tell it right now in the interest of time. But the moral of the story is that that the effort of increasing human development and bettering people's lives is an energy-intensive one. And this is precisely why states who came together to cooperate to mitigate climate change were very concerned to ensure that access to energy be secured for middle income and low income countries. These countries didn't want the effort to mitigate climate change to prevent them from having access to electrification. So somehow then the process of mitigating climate change has to be made consistent with the process of increasing electrification for much of the world. So that's the idea of the significance of the right to promote sustainable development. In philosophy, of course, we like to think in terms not just of of a position, but we like to think about the kinds of arguments that can be made in defense of the position. And when it comes to the right to sustainable development, I think that there are three fairly strong arguments that can be made. The first is the one that essentially I've been offering to you up to this point, which is that poverty eradication is of fundamental moral importance, and poverty eradication requires energy. So we have to secure access to energy for middle income and low income countries. But there's another argument that can be made that's on the basis of fairness. So if you take the idea of dealing with climate change as a cooperative effort among states, then that cooperation has to proceed on fair terms. And the terms of cooperation would be unfair if the demands that it made on states would undercut the very reasons that they have to pursue the cooperative effort in the first place. And for many middle income and low income states, the reason that they have to pursue the cooperative effort is poverty eradication, right? Climate change is really bad from the perspective of poverty. It's going to immiserate hundreds of millions of people. But if in the pursuit of that aim of poverty eradication, they're asked to make sacrifices to their development efforts in the form of not having access to energy, then they're being asked to make a sacrifice that undermines the very basis of the cooperative effort. So an unfair demand would be made on states. And then finally, and very simply, it's a matter of just honoring a promise. The states who signed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change made a promise to respect the right to promote sustainable development, and they have an obligation to honor that promise. Okay, so that's the idea then that the right to promote sustainable development is a matter of international justice. And the reason why this turns out to be important in the context of climate change is because it has implications for responsibility for dealing with the problem of climate change. I see justice and responsibility as twin moral concepts, that the concept of justice is an account of the moral creditors in the sense that it's an account of who has certain entitlements, right? Which party has certain entitlements. And responsibility is an account of the moral debtors in the sense that it's an account of who it is that's obliged to meet those entitlements, right? To respond to those entitlements. So when we have an understanding of international justice, it gives us an idea of what the corresponding account of responsibility should be. And in this case, the corresponding account of responsibility, if we take seriously the right to promote sustainable development, is that responsibility for climate change mitigation in the sense of funding the global transition to renewable energy, the responsibility has to fall first and foremost on highly developed countries, because it's only by placing responsibility on those countries that we can ensure that the burden will be carried in ways that won't incur losses from the perspective of trying to deal with the problem of global poverty. So the right to promote sustainable development suggests that entails that highly human developed countries should take the lead in securing the technology and in securing the financing for middle income and low income countries, such that they can make the transition to renewable energy in a way that won't increase the costs of energy generation and then slow the human development effort. Okay, so that's the way in which climate change, one of the ways in which climate change is profoundly connected to the problem of poverty, global poverty. So I started out by showing you that we're not on track to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, that much more needs to be done. And since it's such an obviously important effort, one might ask why it is that we're failing so miserably at this point. And there are lots of theories out there. There are theories that have to do with collective action problems. There are theories in some of the philosophical literature that have to do with what some people claim to be the moral complexity of the problem. I don't think that those theories are particularly convincing. We could talk about why if you wanted in the question period, but I want to talk about what I think is really one of the most important problems. It's not the only problem, but I think it's one of the most important, and politically it is the most important. And it has to do with the fact that not everybody is going to benefit by this transition to renewable energy. That limiting warming to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees will require leaving substantial amounts of fossil fuel unburned in the ground. These are assets of the fossil fuel industry that will be stranded. It's capital that they won't be able to exploit, and it's capital of tremendous value. It's estimated that the value of the fossil fuels that will have to stay in the ground is somewhere on the order of between $1 to $4 trillion, right? This is money that won't be made, right? These are assets that can't be exploited by the fossil fuel industry. So they have a profound interest then in either denying the problem outright or delaying dealing with the solution to the problem. We have a profound business interest in seeing to it that they continue to have access to the assets that are in the ground. And this is the most important political problem confronting the climate movement. The fossil fuel industry recognizes this problem, and they've taken very significant efforts to try to deal with it from their perspective, right? To try to slow the process of dealing with the problem of climate change. So, for example, during the Obama administration of the 113th Congress in the United States, the fossil fuel industry and their lobbying organization spent $351 million donating to congressional campaigns. And as a result of that effort, they received $42 billion in federal production and exploration subsidies, right? If you think about this just as an investment, a business investment, it was a very shrewd business investment on their part. It paid off very significantly. An influential NGO that has a very nice webpage, Influence Map, reports that obstructive climate policy and lobbying in the United States may be on the order of $500 million annually. So because of this $1 to $0.4 trillion that are at stake, the fossil fuel industry seeks to influence the political process in ways that allow them to continue to have access to their assets that are in the ground. This is what I refer to as a plutocratic distortion of American democracy, right? Plutocratic means that there's an influence of money that's distorting the democratic politics of the United States. But it's not just in the United States. Unfortunately, it's a global problem, and it also occurs at the level of international negotiations. So at the last Congress of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that met last year in Egypt, there were more representatives of the fossil fuel industry at that Congress, right, than there were representatives of the 10 most affected countries, the countries most affected by climate change. So fossil fuel industry was there, making sure that people knew what their perspective was, trying to influence the way the discussions went, trying to exert whatever influence they could have over the process. And next year's Conference of the Parties will be held, of all places, in the United Arab Emirates, right? And the director, the head, the president of the Congress of Parties will be the head of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. So if you're expecting major significant breakthroughs next year at the COP, you're going to be, I think, very disappointed. And this also filters down to the jurisprudence of the United States. Maybe we don't want to go into this in the interest of time, but there was a very important Supreme Court decision last year, West Virginia versus the Environmental Protection Agency, that stripped the power of the EPA to regulate certain things that were important from the perspective of limiting emissions. And of course, the court is a very conservative court, and the conservative justices of the court were at various critical points in the course of their career supported by conservative jurisprudential organizations like the Federalist Society and others, and the Federalist Society and these other organizations have been funded by the fossil fuel industry. So what I don't mean to suggest is that this is a conspiracy. It's not as if there's one particular player pulling the strings behind all of this. What I do mean to suggest is that there are very wealthy interests that use the money that they have to try to exert influence over politics. And this is a tremendous problem from the perspective of dealing with climate change. It's a plutocratic distortion of the democratic process in the United States, but also internationally. Okay, so that I think explains in large measure, not entirely, but in large measure, why we are not moving with the speed that we need to move. So what would it mean if we failed to limit warming to 1.5 or even 2 degrees? What if we only limit warming to 2.8 degrees, right? What would the world look like? Well, it would be, according to the Pentagon, a world that would be marked by increased natural disasters, increased refugee flows, increased conflicts over basic resources such as food and water. This would put pressure on the democracies of Western Europe and the United States, but it would put pressure on these relatively well-to-do countries because it would devastate other parts of the globe. And that kind of failure would be of course, would result in tremendous human suffering. It would result in a world that could be described, I think, as a world of global apartheid, right? It would mean that parts of the world would be rendered nearly uninhabitable. There would be conflicts over resources. There would be internal migration of people in the warmer parts of the world or the more flood-prone parts of the world would be moving around. Some of these people would be crossing borders. That would create conflicts between states. That would create refugee flows, and that would create tensions also in the more highly developed world. But it would be a world that would be marked by, some countries that are relatively privileged in North America and in Europe and maybe Australia and Japan. Probably resorting to building higher walls, trying to militarize their borders even more, trying to police bodies of water that people are trying to cross, and billions of people desperately trying to gain access to those countries, a kind of something like a global apartheid. Of course, that kind of separation between the poor and the rich might not only be internationally. It could result in the breakdown of justice also within the wealthy countries. If you don't know about this book, I can only recommend it to you. It was written 30 years ago by Octavia Butler, but it tells the story of a young woman in Southern California, living in Southern California after warming has not been successfully dealt with, and she tries to live securely in her little neighborhood, Southern California neighborhood, trying to keep the poorer parts of Southern California at bay. It turns out, of course, that it's not successful. People make it over the wall, and she has to go on flight with her friends. It's a terrific sort of near future. Sort of scary forecast about what could be in store if we fail to mitigate climate change successfly. This says something about humanity, I think. We talk about the idea that human beings have entered into a new epoch called the Anthropocene. We could fail in the effort of mitigating climate change, resulting in the kind of circumstances that I've just described, which I would characterize as the misanthropocene. Why do I call it the misanthropocene? Because it would be the result of collective irrationality in the sense that we all knew that there was a better world, and we failed in the collective effort to bring it about, right? We failed to control the interests in society that sought to continue to exploit fossil fuels and kept us on the wrong path. It would also be a failure of reasonable cooperation. Our international politics would have failed in producing a reasonable cooperative effort. Instead, they would have been dominated by commercial interests, in particular the fossil fuel industry, national rivalries. So we have these rational powers to pursue the good. We have these reasonable powers to cooperate, and we would have failed to realize these rational and reasonable powers. We would have failed in a kind of profound sense in the possibilities that humanity had. It would be a world that was made by the human species, right? No other species would be capable of such colossal failure to destroy the planetary ecosystem in which they flourished. So that's why I call it the misanthropocene, because there's a way in which we can think about this as having condemned humanity. And this kind of misanthropic thinking is not something that is a stranger to Western philosophy. Kant engaged in similar kinds of prospective thinking when he thought about what it would mean to fail to bring about a peaceful international order if countries only continued to be at war with each other into the indefinite future, which, as it turns out, has been the case. Kant said that that would be, quote, a constant reproach to the glory and the wisdom of non-rational creation, right? Human beings, in comparison to the rest of nature, would look pathetic. Quote, such a spectacle would force us to turn away from ourselves in revulsion, Kant claims. And a 20th century philosopher who was profoundly influenced by Kant in a number of ways, John Rawls, talks also in misanthropic terms. If it would turn out that human beings were never able to create a just order, he says, quote, if a reasonably just society that subordinates power to its aims is not possible, and people are largely amoral, if not incurably cynical and self-centered, one might ask with Kant whether it was worthwhile for human beings to live on Earth. So what I'm suggesting is, of course it's enough to say that there would be profound human suffering, there would be profound injustice, but it also suggests something perhaps even more poignant, which is that it suggests that humanity itself is in some very profound sense a failure, that's part of what's at stake in this debate, in this effort, in this struggle to mitigate climate change and to make the Anthropocene a place that could be livable for humanity. Okay, so I don't want to end on that note. I want to try to end on something somewhat more hopeful. So let me just say a word about hope. I take hope to be a kind of an attitude that involves a readiness to pursue something because it's good and because it's possible. So when we're hopeful, we stand ready to the extent that we're able to pursue something that we take to be good because we take it to be good and possible. So when we think about evaluating hopes, when we think about whether hopes are well placed or not, we can evaluate hopes in two ways. We can talk about whether or not the object of our hope is sufficiently likely, sufficiently possible, and we can talk about whether or not it's sufficiently good. And these are important when we try to develop a politics of hope. When we try to develop a politics of hope, part of what we should be trying to do is to convincing people that the better world is both sufficiently likely, sufficiently possible, and that it's sufficiently good. So I think it's clearly the case with climate change mitigation that the better world is sufficiently good. There's all sorts of ways in which the world would be much better if we could mitigate climate change. There'd be less damage due to climatic disruptions. There'd be fewer droughts, fewer fires, less flooding, fewer tropical storms. It would also be the case that people would have cleaner air and groundwater. Populations would be healthier. There'd be less international conflict due to energy independence, because there would be energy independence. And very significantly, if we were able to base our energy on renewable energy, there would be increased employment. It turns out to be the case that renewable energy results in employment gains. And this is very important in trying to develop popular support for renewable energy. It's a job growth strategy to pursue renewable energy. So there's all sorts of ways in which the imagined future, the future of the climate activists, is a better future, and these need to be promoted in the politics of climate activism. I think it's very important to point out the ways in which the world could be better in order to produce this, in order to support this hopeful message. It's also important to think about how it's possible. And when it comes to the possibility of the better world, I have an idea that I developed in the book called Hope Makers. And hope makers are facts about the world, their social processes, their theories of plausible visions, they're the actions of others, they're even our own actions. Anything that provides a reason to think that the better world is more likely constitutes a hope maker. And because the better world would be brought about by human action, right? Not brought about by some natural process independent of human beings, but it would be the result of political action. Then the activity of others provides hope for us to think that it's possible, and our own actions provide hope for others to make them think that it's possible. So that's the way in which hope can be mobilized. When we act, we provide reasons for others to think that the action can be, or the object of the action can be achieved. When Martin Luther King was talking about the protesting students during the civil rights movement, he said, quote, that theirs is a movement based on a philosophy, the possibility of the future bringing into being something real and meaningful. It's a movement based on hope. King was acutely aware of the role of hope in mobilizing the civil rights movement. King's not often appreciated as a theorist of mass mobilization. He's often appreciated as a theorist of nonviolence and as a theorist of civil disobedience, but he's not often appreciated as a theorist of mass mobilization. But of course, he was both a theorist and a leader of a successful movement. And because of that, I think we do well to take King's discussions of mass organizing very seriously. And part of what King understood is that mass mobilization is important in order to confront entrenched interests. And mass mobilization, King understood to be very difficult and to be something that requires a certain kind of tenacity, a certain kind of strategic intelligence, and tremendous patience. So he says, ours is an experience that marches must continue over a period of 30 to 45 days to produce any meaningful results, right? It's not just a one-shot thing, King thinks. They must also be of sufficient size to produce some inconvenience to the forces in power, or they will go unnoticed. I like this word inconvenience, right? It's a very sort of subtle, understated word for what King probably has in mind, right? There's going to be disruptions as a result of mass mobilization. If the method is not effective, no matter how much steam it releases, it's an expression of weakness, not of strength. It's interesting here that King is really uncompromising when it comes to what the point of mobilization is. It's not, King thinks, to make you feel better, except insofar as making you feel better brings you back the next time, but rather it's the point of mass mobilization is to build the movement, right? To make the next demonstration bigger than the one before, to make that one bigger than the next, and in the end, to produce effects. And that's the primary strategic consideration for King, not, as he puts it here in this passage, to release steam. So I think we can learn from what King has to say about mass mobilizations, and I think it points us in the direction of the tremendous importance of the recent climate protests that were led by young people around the world. That the activism of young people around the world the last few years have been a very important, perhaps the most important hope maker when it comes to climate change. So I'll close. This is the last bit. Thanks for hanging in there with a quotation from Ernst Bloch, who was a post-war German philosopher who wrote an important 3-volume book called The Principle of Hope. I like this quotation a lot because I think it's very applicable to the current times that we're living in here. And I'm going to read it and comment on it as I read it. The work against anxiety about life and the machinations of fear is that against its creators, right? It's work against the creators of the anxiety, who are for the most part easy to identify. I think we know who the sources are of the anxiety in the world that we live in, the fossil fuel industry. And it looks in the world itself for what can help the world. And this can be found. And I think we know the way forward sort of in general. It can be found, and we have to figure out how to do it. So that's the talk. That's the book. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to talking to you about it.
I have a curious question.
Who is that?
Yeah, my name is Elijah.
Hi, Elijah.
Hi. I really found the presentation very interesting, and I just wanted to ask a question. Would you say that our move towards building electric cars and would you say that would be would you say that's a more environmentally friendly move?
Well, it's a friendly move from the perspective of the climate. It's not an all things considered clean move or green move because it relies upon the extraction of minerals. But it's from the perspective of the climate, it's a friendly move. Yes, I mean, we need to electrify buses. We need to electrify mass haul transit, intercontinental transit, and there's going to be there'll be people driving in personal vehicles or in shared vehicles into the future. And from that perspective, they have to be either electric or hydrogen fuel cells. So I think it's an important proximate step to take.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Should I read Matthew's? I think Matthew has a question. Should I read that? And Matthew says,
if you like.
Sorry? Or Matthew, do you want to ask it?
Well, it's saying if you prefer. I prefer to write them that way. Everybody can understand the question.
Okay, so it says a pro-poor climate theory. Do poor countries with corrupt governments enjoy the same claims of international justice as countries with less corruption? That's a great question. I mean, corruption is it's a terrible problem. And of course, it's not limited. I mean, it's important to note that it's not limited to just poor countries. I've suggested that there are these very profound plutocratic tendencies, even in American democracy. But yes, I mean, I think the answer is under current conditions, what we should be primarily concerned about is the extent to which an international policy will provide the framework for countries to pursue poverty eradicating human development. We can't, within the context of a climate change treaty, solve the problem, I think, of corruption within developing countries. All we can do is provide a framework in which developing countries are able to, if the politics is right within the country, are able to continue to pursue the program of poverty eradication. So this isn't, we're not trying to solve all the problems of the world here, right? All we can do within this framework is ensure that if a country's politics are right internally, that they'll have the capacity to continue to pursue poverty eradicating human development.
I have sort of two questions. The first is, do you think that there is a cleaner or greener way to industrialize underdeveloped countries as the way that we have thus far in both America and developed
So I didn't hear that super well, but I think you're asking me, is there a cleaner way to industrialize in countries that are still either going through industrialization or have not yet industrialized than the way in which the industrialized countries industrialized? If I think that's the force of the question. Yes, I mean, I think that's the point of the renewable energy transition, is that what needs to happen in parts of the world that haven't yet industrialized or only beginning the industrialization process is that that needs to be on the basis of renewable energies.
And my second question, sorry, you can't hear me very well, is to what extent can capitalism continue to exist with its adherence to trust and things like that, and still have like a green or at least not completely destroy climate?
I can't make sense of it. Did anybody make sense of it? Can anybody help?
Couldn't hear.
Sorry, you're just not
It came in pretty broken.
Yeah. So
Sorry.
Just try typing.
Sorry. Yeah, well, not while you're driving. Stop and type. Okay, so Joy is asking if the Capitalocene is a more appropriate term for this area, given that humans existed for tens of thousands of years without causing climate catastrophe. Yeah, there's this discussion about how best to characterize this period that scientists are calling the Anthropocene, and Jason Moore and others, Andres Malm, have suggested that the term the Capitalocene is more appropriate. I'm not hostile to their suggestion, but I think it confuses matters. I think what it does is provides it attempts to provide an account of moral responsibility for something that is, when talked about in terms of the Anthropocene, doesn't mean to be attributing moral responsibility, right? When people talk in terms of the Anthropocene, there's not an effort to say that human beings are morally responsible for this. There's only an effort to say that human beings are causally responsible for this. I mean, if it were to turn out, right? I mean, think about it this way: if it were to turn out that we managed this and that we produced a better world for everyone, which is possible. I mean, the big part of my argument is that it is possible. Then would Moore and Malm still want to call it the Capitalocene? I mean, that would be to give credit to capitalism in a way that I would think that they wouldn't want to do. So I think there's a way in which they're adding confusion to the analysis when they attempt to moralize it in that way, just by means of moralizing the name. So I would resist the effort to change the terminology in that way. Let's see. Or, I mean, assuming that what we're talking about is an era of pervasive human impact, right? And assume that that Moore and Malm get their way and that there's a socialist global revolution, there's still going to be the age of pervasive human impact. So should we continue to call it the Capitalocene? I mean, I think they're just introducing a confusion, trying to moralize something that's essentially a matter of natural scientific technology. So Drake asks, do you feel that the modern peaceful protests are as effective as they have been in the past, such as during MLK's time? I feel our recent protests over police brutality won only very small victories, which are already being written out of legislation. Also, how realistic do you think a general strike would be to repeal Citizens United? Oh, I don't really want to get into Citizens United. I want to dodge that question. I'm sorry, Jake, but I will talk about the activism part. So, I mean, I think what we probably should do is go back to that quotation by King, and the quotation by King, if we take it seriously about the sort of tenacity and patience that's involved, then I think King would say that we're really only at the beginning of what's required. That's, of course, sobering news, right? It's not the news that anybody wants to hear, but what I think what the Kingian view, if you can put it that way is that up to this point, we're only really just getting started. That there has to be much more of what's begun, and the efforts at mass mobilization have to increase very significantly if we're going to be successful. There's no guarantee, right? There's no guarantee that this will be successful. I mean, if there were a guarantee, then we wouldn't be talking about hope. We would be talking about some kind of confidence that we have about the future. But because what we're trying to draw on are resources of hope, we're trying to mobilize hope. It's precisely because we worry that we may not be successful. But there's something dangerously self-fulfilling about pessimism, right? What's dangerously self-fulfilling about pessimism is, to the extent that pessimism leads to inaction, then we know what the future will hold for us. So hope plays a very important role in the way in which it produces this feedback to produce more action in the direction of the positive aim. My approach to environmentalism is primarily focused on environment as valuable because human interests. Is there room in my approach for the environment being valuable in and of itself? That's a great question, Will. Thank you. So I have been speaking in what sometimes people refer to as anthropocentric terms. I've been talking about the environment as something that is valuable insofar as it's valuable to human beings. That's not my considered view about the environment. I think that features of the natural world have a value that's independent of human interests. And I think that part of what is irrational about our current policies is that we are not preserving that value, right? That there is value there that should be preserved, and it should be preserved regardless of whether it serves human interests. That part of what it means to say that the natural world has an intrinsic value, a value that is that is other than its value to human beings, is that it should be preserved, and we're not preserving it. That wasn't part of the talk that I provided to you today, but that is part of my considered view. So there is room, in my view, for that. Yeah. In terms of turning the world, electric vehicles and the like, how does cobalt and cobalt mining play a factor in this transition? Is it possible to obtain cobalt in a humane way where humans are not exploited as they currently are? So I think that it's going to be a key part of this transition, if we're really going to build a broad popular transition, that we involve working people and their unions in the process. If we want to build the kind of broad popular support that's necessary, then we're going to need to ensure that the transition that occurs and the new technologies that are developed in the process of that transition are ones that are created by union labor, that are created by working people working in decent and humane conditions. That's a matter of justice, but I think it's also a matter of strategy. It's a matter of building popular support for broad popular support for the movement towards an economy, a global economy based on fossil fuels. At 3, what are we waiting for? Hopeful politics. Because we believe climate change is anthropogenic, we also presume that human effort can positively affect the way in which the climate is changing. Suppose that no amount of human effort can positively affect the way in which the climate is changing. Would those same efforts be better spent preparing for the eventuality of a changed climate? Yeah, I mean, yeah, if there's nothing we can do, right? I mean, that's a supposition I want to fight, right? But if we assume it, if we're just engaged in that what I think is a counterfactual, if we were just engaged in that counterfactual, then yes, we should be prepared for. We should be preparing ourselves for the changing climate. So if it's not the result of human action, right? If it's say it's a result of some kind of cosmic galactic force that we can't stop, then what we should be doing is trying to defend ourselves against the eventual changes. Absolutely. But But why should we engage in that counterfactual? I don't understand why we would want to do that. You make a good, I'm just continuing to read these. I don't know if this is what you guys prefer. If somebody wants to, like really use their voice to ask a question, that's great with me, but I'll read them if that's what you guys prefer. You make a good case that change is possible, but what are the conditions of possibility required? Under global neoliberal system, which forwards market-driven solutions and elevates individual morality and choices as the only options among which to choose, is change possible? Well, I mean, the hope of the talk is that change is possible. That change is possible. That we have historical examples of people mobilizing under conditions that are at least as bad as the conditions that we're talking about. If you think about the conditions under which African Americans mobilized in the late 50s and early 60s, they were up against at least as powerful of an enemy as what the climate movement is up against today. I think maybe somebody would want to challenge me on that, but at least I think that at the very least we can say is that these were movements that were developed under very harsh conditions at the very least, right? Maybe we don't have to engage in the comparison. And change is possible under those conditions if we have brave and astute leadership, if we have a brave citizenry that's willing to participate, if we have an energized, mobilized citizenry, a hopeful movement can be built and can affect change. That's the message. Is AI something to be concerned about in regards to environmental issues? Yes, probably in more than one way. I mean, obviously, one of the things that people are noticing is that artificial intelligence is incredibly energy consuming, and that's obviously a concern. It's a concern in the way that, of course, anything that uses energy is a concern. Part of what we need to do is to economize and to become more efficient in our energy usage, and AI presents problems in that way. Of course, AI can also be used as a tool to try to figure out how to economize and how to become more efficient and how to make the grid smarter, for example, so that we use less energy at various times of the day. So it can be, I think, both a tool and a problem. The recent breakthrough with fusion energy has been promoted for years as the final solution for climate change. What do you think? I don't know. I'm not an energy specialist, so I hesitate to say, but these kinds of things are important, I think. And I mean, I think it's been very important that the technologies of solar and wind have developed to the extent that they've developed. It's part of the reason why we think that there's a solution now, because the technologies of solar and wind have developed to the extent that they have. Of course, we need the right kinds of policies to make them develop even more. We have to stop subsidizing the fossil fuel industry and begin promoting, through industrial policy, begin promoting solar and wind in a way that will make them even more competitive and better developed. But yeah, these other, if there are other forms of technology that can lead us out of this problem, then they could be very significant. I do think in this context, it's really important for people to just face up to the reality that there is no risk-free future, right? When it comes to energy policy, there's no risk-free future, that any way forward is going to have risks associated with it. And this becomes very important when we think about assessing various different ways forward. But even if we go full scale into wind and solar, there's still certain risks associated to whether or not we can develop sufficient battery capacity, right? Whether we can have a certain base level of energy that will be provided at all times. These are all risks associated with that strategy as well. Are we still developing green technology at a decent rate? Is there any way that such technology could create profitable, realistic solution to climate change similar to how we deal with the ozone? Or is this more likely to slow and inconvenient fight? So renewable energy is being developed at an incredibly quick rate. I think there's every reason to think that it can be scalable and that it can provide a great deal of the energy future that we need. The problem that that we're trying to figure out with respect to that kind of technology is whether or not it can provide a base when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, whether we have sufficient battery technology, or if we have to rely on other sources of energy as well, and then what those forms of energy would be. But I think there's every reason to be very hopeful about renewable energy. The problem, of course, is the development of it is counter the interests of the fossil fuel industry, right? The fossil fuel industry is doing everything it can to prevent that development. And they're hanging tightly onto their subsidies that they receive from governments around the world. This has become a very technology focused discussion at this point.
Darrel, if you're through for the moment with the typed questions, I have one for you that I can.
Yeah, it looks like Kimberly does as well. I'm just noticing that. So whichever, Tim, why don't you go and then we'll have Kimberly go.
Okay, great. I believe someone said that you lead a research group at your university, and I was wondering if your group is involved in activism, if your group or your students are involved in activism, and if you've had any access to politicians and the press.
We're not as a group involved in activism, but people in the group are involved in activism, and I think most of us aren't involved in organizing the demonstrations, but most of us are involved in attending the demonstrations. We don't attend as a group, but we do sometimes see each other at these things. I have one student who is very involved, and she's probably one of the organizers of some of the demonstrations. In terms of politicians, no, but there are people in the larger research unit that I work with that are close to some of the leading Green politicians. Robert Habeck is the Minister of Energy and Economy in Germany right now. He's the Green, probably the second most powerful politician in Germany today, and he's somebody that's close to some people in the Frankfurt School.
Yeah, and how green would you say the Green Party is in Germany? How good
Oh.
are they on environmental issues?
I don't know. I don't know how you measure greenness. I mean, I think you know, I guess this is a hard question. I'm somewhat sympathetic, I guess, to what they're doing. I mean, in terms of the parties that are in terms of the political party landscape in Germany, let's put it that way, right? In terms of the political party landscape, what's on offer? The Green Party has been doing a good job. They need to be pressured. They're subject to the same kind of pressures that all elected officials are. They shouldn't be given a pass in that way. And I think that sometimes they don't. If I were to criticize the Green Party, I would criticize them not on the grounds of their greenness, but whether or not they have enough of a social agenda, whether or not they see the linkages between the environmental program and the need to support the poor in the energy transition in Germany. So a major issue that's going on in Germany right now, that's just been introduced in the last, few weeks really, is the need, it will come someday to the United States, but I don't imagine it's being talked about yet, is the need to introduce heat pumps in houses and apartments and businesses. Every furnace has to be replaced, right? Anything that heats on the basis of fossil fuels will have to be replaced in every dwelling in every country in the world. And the technology that's replaced by is something called a heat pump. And this is an electric device that warms a house. If we're going to make the energy transition, it has to happen. It has to happen everywhere eventually. So that's what I mean by to say that it will come to the United States as well. The Greens, to their credit, are are bringing this up as an issue, and they're trying to put forward legislation about this. But they're leaving themselves open to criticism because they haven't adequately dealt with the problem of the expenses. That this has to be done at significant government subsidies. While I think they're coming around to understanding this, they've only come around to understand this as a result of criticism. Kimberly.
Hi. I lived in Germany for quite some years, and there's a town time, and a lot of their houses, I think they were newer homes. This is like back in the 1990s. They had a big, huge sugar beet processing plant, and a lot of the houses were heated by steam, and they didn't require the oil.
Yeah.
In order to heat them. But I mean, that's when you were talking about, using fossil fuels to heat and going to heat pumps. But my question is you were talking about solar and wind. And I just took an oceanography class last semester. And one of our things, it's still in the research, is ocean. But it's not the ones, because I looked at all the research and stuff, and they were showing where they would like sink them in the ocean, and they would sit there and rise and fall and turn the turbines. But their problem is the salt water would eat up the machinery. But there was a new one that was actually land-based, and that it had a turbine inside, and it didn't have to worry about all the tides rise and fall. It was just like this little piece that went in, and as the water was brought in, it would push the air to push the turbine, and then the water would go back out. But the turbine, of course, wouldn't turn the opposite way, would continue to turn, the same way, whether the water was going in or out. And I found that to be a very interesting technology as far as creating energy.
Yeah,
I don't know if
that's
you've-
happening. I mean, tidal energy or electricity generation is something that people are doing a lot of research into. I don't know anything about this. As I said, I'm not an energy expert, but I mean, it's obvious. You just go look at the waves and you see that there's power there, right? And that's power to be harnessed in ways. And the question is how to do it in a way that doesn't cost too much, in the sense that it doesn't require more energy to develop than it's produced as a result of it. So that's, as I understand it, that's been the big problem. But of course, this could be a tremendous source of renewable energy.
Yeah, I mean, because I live out here in the Mojave Desert in Southern California, and we have a lot of wind generators, and of course we have big solar plants out here because we have a lot of sunshine and a lot of wind. But even they have problems.
There's something for me giving this talk at the same time that I'm talking to people driving cars is very odd, I have to say.
Oh no, I'm actually parked.
Okay.
No, I'm parked.
Good. Okay. All right, Rodney.
Yeah. So it seems like, I mean, you want to give us like some sort of message of hope, right? And there's a lot of hope regarding the technology, but it seems that part of your argument is that the only way to really avoid the ecological cataclysm is if we as a global society make the preferential choice for the poor. And what gives you hope, in that regard?
Yeah. So I think it's a feature of the international process that that there won't be significant climate change mitigation unless the interests of the middle income and low income countries are met, because they'll just block continued efforts. They're not going to forego their development interests. And insofar as they stand firm on that, then the only way the mitigation process is going to be possible, the condition of the success of global climate change mitigation, is to bring these countries on board. It's of the nature of climate change mitigation that it has to happen in every country of the world. What we have to do is achieve what's called net zero global emissions, right? Which means very close to gross zero emissions in every country in the world. It can't just happen in the industrialized countries. It has to happen everywhere. And the only way that's going to happen is if the developed countries secure the development interests of the developing and least developed countries. So they have a certain power in the process that gives us reason to think that at least when it comes to mitigation, climate change mitigation, that the interests of the poor will be observed in the process. It's a different and more difficult story when we come to climate change adaptation, which are the policies that are required to protect communities against the climate change that's already occurred or that will occur even with mitigation. And that's a more difficult process because that can happen locally, right? Countries can adapt to climate change to some extent on their own. They don't need the cooperation of other countries. So that power dynamic isn't built into that process. And so politically, it's a much more difficult process, and it requires a form of international solidarity that I think will have to be developed.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I understand that you guys have to leave at 12:30, but I don't know if I can continue to talk.
Yeah, why don't we formally sort of wrap this up, and then if anybody wants to stick around and ask questions, if you're open to that, that would be wonderful. But thank you so much for your talk. It was wonderful. Thanks to everybody who showed up. Thanks to Tim Chapman for arranging this with these other colleges, Riverside and Barstow and Victor Valley, and thanks to those chairs who spread the word and worked with us to make this a great event. So I'll stop the recording, but yeah, I mean, if there's anybody who wants to stick around, feel free. I'll keep the Zoom meeting open.
Thank you all for your attention and for the questions. It was wonderful to talk to you about this.